Welcome to The Growth Factor, a broadcast ministry of St. Mark Baptist Church. Today, as part of our family, you will experience the life-changing and spirit-nurturing Word of God. Please enjoy this time with us, where we're committed to helping you grow in knowledge, grow in faith, and grow in God. St. Mark Baptist Church, you grow here.
Welcome back to the Growth Factor podcast, a broadcast ministry of the St. Mark Baptist Church here in Little Rock, Arkansas. I'm your co-host, Pastor John. I'm here, a pastor of St. Mark Baptist Church in Little Rock, and I'm here with our senior pastor, Dr. Philip L. Pointer Sr. He joins me on these episodes, and we have an amazing time. It's good to be back for a new season.
Feels good.
And I'm looking forward to this new season that we're calling simply Better. We've already looked at Exodus in our last season. We're going to look at the book of Hebrews and talk about why Jesus is better than all of that we covered in the book of Exodus. And we're going to do that in one season. We're going to do that. I hope we can get through that in one season. So looking forward to joining you all on this episode. We'll see you guys soon. Well, Pastor P, I could not wait to start this new study on the book of Hebrews. In this lesson, we're going to talk about the God who speaks, the God who has spoken in past through the prophets, and the God who ultimately spoke through his son, Jesus. But we're going to take the opportunity first to practice what we preach.
Yes.
Because we've told people, before you dive into a book of the Bible, you want to make sure you get a big picture and understanding the big picture. And we talked about the 3 A's of context. We talked about author, audience, and atmosphere. So let's go ahead and do that, because I think people think that when we approach our sermon process that we don't go through this. But we were just talking about this before.
Yeah.
The first thing we do is we make sure we understand the big picture of the book itself.
Yeah.
Before we dive into that, and we want to put that into practice tonight.
Yeah, and if you were with us in our last season and series of study, then you know how important context is. And it's not just the context of a verse with the verses that surround it. That's critical. But who wrote it, when they wrote it, who they wrote it to, and why they wrote it. If you don't have those things, it is easy to misunderstand the Bible. Taking those things out of context creates an atmosphere and opportunity for misinterpretation, which ultimately leads to misapplication. So it's always important, Pastor John. It is always critical, and we do this as a practice to prepare sermons, to prepare Bible studies, and in our own personal devotional lives, to make sure we understand who's writing, who they're writing to, when, where, why they're writing.
Yeah, so let's start tonight with the author, but I just want to say briefly, as a new believer, when I came upon the book of Hebrews, and back then I was reading King James because I was raised Baptist, and that's all we read, right?
Yes, sir.
So when I came to the book of Hebrews, the first verse, I was just like, I'm going to have to go somewhere else. Because it said, God who at sundry times and diverse manners. I'm like, what is a sundry? I'm going to the Gospel of John, because I'm not fooling up with Hebrews. Yeah. But, N.T. Wright says that Hebrews is really the Christian introduction to the Old Testament.
Yes.
He says that as a believer, it makes the connection between the Old Testament and the New Testament. And it's right for us to be able to move from our study in Exodus to moving into Hebrews on tonight, right?
Yeah, it's a great partnership between the study that we just had in Exodus, and we'll be referring through the study to some Exodus incidents and accounts, very much so, and then seeing how those things have foreshadowed and then are inferior to the Lord Jesus Christ, who's the ultimate expression of God. When you talk about the study of Hebrews, and we talk about this context issue, one of the things that's critical is to understand it's called Hebrews because it's written to those who were Hebrew believers, Jewish people who grew up learning, listening to, reading the Torah, those first 5 books of the Bible, revering Moses as the giver of the law, and understanding Moses through Moses and the prophets of old, and then they came to faith in Christ. We'll talk about this extensively, but the temptation was for them because they were dealing with an ever increasing amount of persecution, physical persecution, not just somebody lying on me talking about me, but actual. Their lives were at risk, and if not their lives, certainly their businesses and relationships were at risk. So they were saying, hey, you know what? I mean, maybe we just go back and practice Judaism, because that was less tense and troubling than trying to follow Jesus. And so the writer or speaker of Hebrews is actually saying, hey, you could go back, but you're going to go back to something inferior. And something that ultimately does not secure your soul eternally, and that's the reason that we have the book of Hebrews. But we understand much of the book of Hebrews because of the study of the Old Testament. So they had this; they grew up in it. This was old hat to them. You know what I mean? They learned it. Many of them, again, we talked about how the Bible was really written to be read out loud or to be memorized. So many of them had Old Testament books or the Pentateuch at least memorized in its totality. And so they were very, very familiar. So for us, as we study it, we have to understand the Old. We have to study the Old. We have to grasp the principles of the Old in the way they did so that we can fully understand the New.
Yeah, and it's that principle of like what's understood doesn't need to be spoken, right?
Exactly.
So, in African American culture, there are things that we read or we see that we don't really have to interpret because this is part of our culture.
You got folk that you can just look at. Y'all don't have to say anything. If one of us starts running, all of us start running.
We out.
You know what I mean? We understand that there's some things that just go along with our culture that you don't have to explain to people. Now, someone else coming in needs the explanation. That's what we are. We are the people coming into, most of us coming into the culture that is first century Judaism, to whom this book was originally written. And so that's the context that we need to grab, the historical, the language, the cultural context that they would understand so we can understand the book of Hebrews.
Yeah, and that's why I don't want people to be discouraged. Like, if you don't understand it, it's okay because it's not written to you specifically in that context, but we can glean from the principles with the tools that we have and understanding their context and kind of bridge that gap, and that's what we're going to do.
Yeah, and thanks be to God for the scholars and the historians and those who work with the languages to give us the ability to understand this Word of God, and so we can take it, study it, and then ultimately understand it, so for the sake of applying it to our lives.
That's what we should have called this. Rosetta Stone for Hebrews. So we can interpret this thing. So let's talk about author real fast, because usually when you look at New Testament books, you'll see the author identifying themselves. Those are the easiest ones to know who wrote them. But where the author does not identify them, you kind of look to church history, you look to other sources to find out. And we're probably going to say what we say about a lot of things when it comes to Scripture. We just don't know.
We don't know
who the author is.
We don't know. So Pastor John, one of the scholarly things that we have to grasp as believers is that there are books in the Bible that we don't know who the author is. Job, we don't know who wrote Job. It could have been Job, could have been one of his children, could have been Eleazar. We don't know who wrote Job, or someone else. We don't know who finished the book of Deuteronomy. We know there are 5 sermons from Moses to the newer generation that's about to inherit the promised land. We don't know who finished it because Moses dies and someone gives a description of his death. Could be Joshua, that seems reasonable, or another scribe or historian among the Hebrew people. Same thing with the Chronicles, 1st Chronicles, 2nd Chronicles, 1st Kings, 2nd Kings. We don't have the names of the person who wrote those books. People like to throw out Ezra and others that are likely, we don't know. When you come to the New Testament, we have pretty good information to identify the authors of New Testament books. Now, some people like to argue that the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, don't say, I, Matthew, am writing this, or I, Mark, am writing this. But we have very, 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 very early witnesses, internal evidence in those books themselves and externally as the interpreters and ministers of the early church were writing about these books and preaching about them, they attributed them to Mark. People would have been alive when Mark wrote it, and they say it, Mark wrote it.
Mm-hmm.
Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, those things. Acts and Luke, we know Luke wrote those because of internal and external evidence. Again, very early. Now, some people like to say, oh, it was added much, much later. No, that's not true. They were very, very, very early attestations to who wrote it. Now, when you come to Hebrews, however, we do not have the early attestation or testimony of who wrote it, and there is no person who identifies himself in this book.
Yeah.
Historically, traditionally, it has been attributed to the Apostle Paul. And people say, oh yeah, Paul wrote the book of Hebrews. Many of us grew up with that. When you do the marriage traditional service, it says, as St. Paul says in the book of Hebrews, marriage is undefiled.
Yeah.
Marriage is honorable among all, and the bed undefiled. But when you look at the language of the book of Hebrews, in the original Greek, it's very different from the letters that Paul writes that we know for certain are from the Apostle Paul. So some have said, well, not Paul. There are other options, Pastor John, like Luke. Yep. Some people say Luke, who wrote the Gospel of Luke and Acts, could be Luke. Struggle with that is that Luke is not a Hebrew necessarily himself. He's more of a, or not a traditional from the Holy Land Hebrew. He's a Greek kind of guy, more Greek leaning. We see that in his writings. Others attribute it to Apollos, who is one of the preachers of the early church, who was, as you read the language of Hebrews, they're very, very artistic, rhetorical flares. One of our emphases this year is creatives, and this is this powerful kind of poetic, spoken word, rhetorical flair kind of book that makes many people, many scholars, and I agree with this part, that many people say it's not something that was just written, but it was probably a sermon preached. Because when you read it out loud, it sounds like preaching. It sounds like a sermon. It's structured in that way. So Apollos. Others say Priscilla. Who is
you about to tell me a woman, a book of the Bible? You about to get into trouble, huh?
It could be Priscilla. There is some legitimate language and which would have made her a preacher, Pastor John, if that's the case. We're gonna get an email from someone.
Somebody.
But it could be Priscilla. There's legitimate. So there are legitimate. What we do know is that it is an early book. The New Testament canon was established based on its relation to the apostles. Either an apostle wrote it or someone who was a direct student of an apostle wrote it. What we do know is that the apostles approved, as it were, so to speak, the theology, the doctrine, the teaching of this book of Hebrews, which I agree with those who believe it is actually a sermon that we're studying, not a letter written in the traditional sense.
Yeah. And many people believe it was written right prior to the destruction of the temple. There's a lot of language in the book of Hebrews that we'll get to later, where you see the temple is referred to, and not referred to as being destroyed, but being still in place. And a lot of scholars believe this is written to be an encouragement to them, because the temple is really about to be destroyed, and they need to be encouraged in knowing that they don't necessarily need a place to gather, but that Christ is better than the temple that is about to be destroyed, that he predicted was going to be destroyed. So this book is written just prior to the destruction of the temple.
And that's such a critical point, Pastor John, when you're studying this book, because it was the temple that was supposed to point to Jesus Christ, but it became for them a point of competition, either Christ or the temple. I can follow Christ, or I can keep the temple going. But the temple was temporary and was 70 AD, completely destroyed, has not been rebuilt since then. And once the Romans came in, because there was an attempt by some Jewish insurrectionists to revolt against Roman rule, they wanted to be independent politically again. Rome came in, leveled that thing, and it has not been rebuilt since. But Christ is still here and available And we'll talk about. I want to say something about his sacrifice being superior, but that's later on.
That's a little later. That's a little later. But
later
I mean, even the disciples fell victim to that temptation, and they're getting ready to enter Jerusalem. They're like, "Hey, Jesus, we got something to show you."
Yeah.
And they're like, "The temple's over here," and Jesus says, "Meh."
I mean, that's cute. That's nice.
That's cute and all.
Y'all got a nice little church over there. It's beautiful.
Right. So they even fell victim to kind of the temple being central for them. And in some way justifiably so, because it was the centerpiece of their worship to God. They were allowed to be able to worship God through it. But God, Jesus himself, as again we're going to talk about, is better. It's better than that.
It's such a lesson for us, and we're just doing context talking. It's such a lesson for us to not let the things that should point us to Christ compete with Christ in our affections, in our hearts. And so, for those who are married to a church building, even, or your favorite pew, this is my seat, that kind of stuff.
Yes, sir.
That those kinds of things become for us in the same way that the temple was for the Hebrews. These things that should facilitate a relationship with Christ, they become it becomes something that competes in our hearts and our affections with Christ. And it's just a reminder to always know that everything, everyone is temporary until he comes again, and that's when those things which are eternal, which matter most, will manifest themselves.
So we're going to look at how the writer of Hebrews began this book to talk about this idea of God speaking, speaking through the prophets and speaking ultimately through his son. So we're going to look at the first 4 verses. I'll read them as a whole, and then we'll kind of break it down and talk about each section. Verse 1 says, chapter 1, verse 1, "Long ago, God spoke to the fathers by the prophets at different times and in different ways."
That's sundry. So if you got a King James, it's sundry and diverse.
Sundry times, diverse
manners. Yes.
In these last days, he has spoken to us by his Son. God has appointed him heir of all things and made the universe through him. The Son is the radiance of God's glory and the exact expression or imprint of his nature, sustaining all things by his powerful word. After making purification for sins, he sat down at the right hand of the Majesty on high. So he became superior to the angels, just as the name he inherited is more excellent than theirs. So let's start by talking about how God spoke before Christ.
Right.
That prior to Christ, God used these agents to be able to speak to God's people who were known as prophets. And he did that in various ways, the text tells us in verse 1, and various times.
I want us to see that the structure of Hebrews is really simple. It's what God used, and now Christ, and Christ is better. And so this in no way diminishes or downplays or negates the significance of the prophets of the Old Covenant, whether in books or as we have them in historical books of the Bible. So if you got a prophet like Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, they have books that bear their names, or you have prophets that are like Elijah, who doesn't have a book that bears his name, but the historical record tells us about his life and ministry and those prophecies. So what the writer of Hebrews is going to do, because again, these people grew up with such deep reverence and respect, and they really understood the significance of these things. The writer's going to say, this thing was great, but Jesus is greater. So that's how the whole book is going to run until we get to the latter portion, which is going to be a lot of practical application. So when you talk about the prophets, the ways God speaks, I talked about it a couple weeks ago in preaching. God reveals God's self. We can't discover God, so God has to reveal himself. So God reveals God's self through what we call general revelation and special revelation. We talked about this in other lessons through the years. And so general revelation is like nature. It's God demonstrating God's godness by the fact that there is a sun, there are stars, that the oceans and the rivers and the seas and the animals and all of creation and the order in creation. This is why science is not the enemy of faith, because the more they discover scientifically, the more order and clearly the artistry of God is seen in creation. As creatives are one of our emphases this year. God is the first creative and chief creative. And so we see those things in creation. That's general revelation. So all humankind has seen creation or experienced creation in some way. Then special revelation is God speaking, God revealing God's self through special means, through things that are not universal to all of humankind in all of history. So through, we talk about in other lessons, theophanies, or God showing up in Old Testament ways, in physical form, by Abraham's tent, in the burning bush, in the fiery furnace, in the cloud, and the pillar that leads him through Exodus. But then God also speaks through prophets. Prophets are a part of special revelation. This also gives way to another idea as we talk about revelation, or the God's self-disclosure, which is progressive revelation, that God doesn't give it all to everyone at one time. In fact, when you talk about the prophets, you'll discover Peter comments that the prophets didn't really understand all that they were prophesying when they were prophesying it. They knew God said to say it. They said it, but they were like, I said it. I don't know what this means, but this is what God told me to say. Because Christ is the master key to understanding all of prophecy. Christ is the Rosetta Stone to understanding all of prophecy. So God, now you got to remember, these people are revering the prophets. I mean, Moses does some prophetic things in his life and through his writing. You get prophets throughout Old Covenant, large and small. The Psalms contain prophecy. So you got poetic prophecies. You got Isaiah, these major prophets who, the eagle-eyed prophet who said Jesus would be wounded for our transgressions. You got all of these great prophecies, great prophets. And because they were so big in their minds, and he says, that's how God spoke. That's how God spoke. And he does not diminish it. But when you compare it to Jesus, we start to see how great Christ is.
And these folks were mediating conversations between God and God's people.
That's so critical.
It starts with Moses, right? He starts as that mediator, standing in the gap between the people and God, and communicating with God, and coming back and communicating with God's people. So you see why they would hold them up to such importance. And we see that even today in Catholic practice, that there's something innate in us that we have to have somebody speak to God for us on our behalf, and then come back and speak to us.
That internal sense of unworthiness, when properly viewing the holiness and glory of God, which is, this is going to make the Christ thing so much better. This is why it's better. I'm getting excited already, Pastor John. That internal sense of unworthiness. I am not worthy. And so God, and so we'll talk about priests later on in the book, but there are two ways. There's a two-way street. A prophet speaks to people on behalf of God. A priest, in fact, speaks to God on behalf of people through sacrifice. So that prophetic utterance was like the people would have no idea what God wanted, what God was doing, where God was at, what God was saying. And graciously, from time to time, they become a prophet, saying, hey, God said. And sometimes those words were encouraging, uplifting, comforting. Sometimes the words was, get it together, or I'm going to destroy you. Or sometimes you didn't get it together, so here's destruction. But whatever it was the only way the people could hear from God. Which is why, again, it was such a major part of their rearing and upbringing, and they know God had spoken. They knew God had spoken because of what they had in the prophets.
So let's look at a couple of things that the prophets did speak. We know that they spoke, but let's talk about what he spoke through the prophets, and look at a couple of texts here. I want to look at 2 Kings to start, chapter 17, and to provide a little bit of context. This chapter probably stems from family drama.
Yeah.
Family drama that starts with Rachel and Leah being married to Jacob and having 12 children, and those children become tribes, and they start all vying for political power. And a lot of people don't know this, but there were actually two separate exiles. So there's an exile of the northern, what became the northern kingdom, who were the Sumerian people, which were part of the tribes of Israel. And then you have the exile for the southern kingdom, which happened in 586 BC. But the northern kingdom actually happened first.
722 BC. The Assyrians come in, and those northern 10 tribes, which actually, Pastor John, man, this is an interesting part of the study. The northern 10 tribes lived on the land that was actually the lush, plush, rich land. If you travel to the Holy Land, you'll know when you go to Galilee in the northern area where Jesus was raised and lived and did most of his ministry. That's the fruitful part of the land, which is why they came and got there first. Because and in addition to that, because of the what is Megiddo, which will be the place of Armageddon, because of the pathway that ran through Megiddo. So the Assyrians come in 722 BC. Say this here's us is
we
in
want
ours.
this land.
And because of the Israelites' unfaithfulness to God, God displaces them, and they are not as a wholesale group. They're not restored. They intermarry, they intermingle, and they become the group known as the Samaritans, which is what makes that New Testament controversy so real, because they were considered by the Jews to be half-breeds.
Those are the northern folks of north.
Yeah.
And that's where we see this text fall in 2 Kings chapter 17. And we have verse 13, but I'll read up just a little bit more just so we can get some context. This disaster, verse 7, happened because the people of Israel sinned against the Lord their God, who had bought them out of the land of Egypt from the power of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, because they worshipped other gods. And that disaster is that Samaria fell into the hands of the Syrians, as you mentioned. They lived according to the customs of the nations that the Lord had dispossessed before the Israelites, according to what the kings of Israel did. The Israelites secretly did things against the Lord their God that were not right. They built high places in all their towns, from the watchtower to the fortified city. They set up for themselves sacred pillars and Asherah's poles on every high hill and under every green tree. They burned incense there on all the high places, just like the nations that the Lord had driven out before them had done. They did evil things, angering the Lord. They served idols, although the Lord had told them, you must not do this. Verse 13, first word, still. The Lord warned Israel and Judah through every prophet and every seer, saying, turn from your evil ways and keep my commands and statutes, according to the whole law I commanded your ancestors and sent to you through my servants, the prophets. So despite all of this idolatry that's happening, they start to take on the customs of the land, the people of the land. And so they are headlong into this idolatrous practice, and he decides still to warn them, to send these prophets to warn them of their rebellion and to cause them to turn towards repentance, to turn back to God.
So what he speaks this judgment here, and there's so many interesting nuggets and tidbits in this passage as we see God. What did God say in the past? He spoke judgment. So we see the clear reasons for the judgment because of their idolatry, their unfaithfulness to God, which when you read the prophets of old covenant literature, you discover that idolatry became the impetus for injustice. And there is always a justice element to spiritual fidelity.
Always.
And because of the idolatry, they begin to fall into injustice. We also see, man, listen, let me tell you one of the things, since we got it right here in this text, Pastor John, one of the things that I chuckle about internally, so I laugh to keep from crying about, is this idea that somehow God's wife was written out of the Bible. When you see this Asherah in verse 10, and people say, well, originally there was Yahweh and there was this wife. And they wrote Asherah, they wrote the wife out of the Bible, and it was two. No, Asherah's right here.
Exactly.
Not written out the Bible at all. Clearly. And Israel worshiped Asherah. Yes, they did. That's what this says. It says that they did that. What it does also say is that Asherah is an idol.
Yeah.
And that Yahweh has no gender. The reason God doesn't need a wife is because God is not male.
Uh-oh.
God is not female. God is spirit.
That's good.
That's why God doesn't need a wife. And Jesus has one. It's called the church. Y'all need to stop talking about her too. Now, anyways, what I'm trying to say is Asherah is here in the text. So please don't let them folk get you with that foolishness. Don't let that be one of the questions where you thrown off and they didn't write her out the Bible. Asherah was a idol in the same way Baal was an idol, in the same way that Egypt had idols. God is not gendered.
Yeah.
And because of that, because here's Pastor John talking about lifting higher. To honor God properly, to gender God is to bring God down.
Yeah, it is.
And that's why they were being judged, because they were making a God in their image rather than recognize they were made in the image of God. And so that judgment, so many tidbits in there. The high places are little side shade tree places to worship anything other than God.
Yeah. And it's interesting that they go from private locations to very public displays. That's a progression.
The progression of their idolatry. One is a little shame in the corner, like our culture is doing with issues of morality, things that used to be done. Ain't nothing being done that ain't been done, but things that people used to have a little shame about. Now they become just wide open, and TikTok and IG are full of high places.
Full of high places.
Yeah.
Full of high places.
Yeah.
But that's one of the things we see. The prophets are able to declare judgment. But one of the things I like about this text is that there's a contrast. Even though y'all are doing all of this, I could give you what you deserve.
Yeah.
But still, I send you someone to tell you to turn back to obeying my commandments and my statutes.
Yeah. Yeah. The still in as translated in the CSB is so important. It's with all of that, and they were doing it for hundreds of years post, and it really started with Solomon. In his latter years, as he's getting all these wives and concubines from the nations around for the sake of political alliances and personal wealth and personal pleasure. It just, that snowball rolls downhill in that northern kingdom of Israel before it goes into Assyrian captivity and exile. And man, they are just getting worse and worse and worse. When you look at the kings of the northern kingdom, they go down, more and more immoral, each one worse than the last. And God, throughout their open, willful idolatry and rebellion, God is still sending them prophets.
Yep. And the South wasn't no better.
No, South wasn't no. Every once in a while, the South will have a good king, but then they would be raggedy too, and then it'd go back down.
Wasn't no better. Wasn't no better.
Yeah,
so we do have judgment there, but then we also see this call to repentance, and we see it uniquely in the life of Hosea, who was a walking sermon illustration.
True.
When God, in the initial chapter, tells him, "Here's what I want you to do personally. I want you to go marry a prostitute."
Pastor John, wait. This is for everybody, oh man, who says, the Lord told me this is my husband. The Lord told me this is my wife. The Lord. So there's only one place in the Bible.
Yep. That's
where
it.
God told somebody to marry somebody.
And who was it?
And it was a prostitute. That's the only place. God didn't even tell Adam to marry Eve. He just brought her, and Adam recognized and said, "This is bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh." The only place you get a wife by revelation or a spouse by revelation is here, where God says, "Marry this person here," and it's a prostitute. So be careful. I'm talking about God told you. It might be.
And he uses that,
yes,
him marrying the prostitute in that way, to illustrate his own people doing the same in the life and time of Hosea. So he takes his own marriage and he says, my people are doing the exact same thing. So what we see in Hosea 6, after these judgments or warnings to Israel and Judah, is a call to repentance.
Yes.
In the first verse, it says, "Come, let us return to the Lord, for he has torn us and he will heal us.
Yes, sir.
He has wounded us and he will bind up our..." Ooh, that's a good text. How much time we got?
I'm gonna have to preach this. Goodness gracious.
He will revive us after 2 days.
Mm-hmm.
And on the third day, he will raise us up so that we can live in his presence. Let us strive to know the Lord. His appearance is as sure as the dawn. He will come to us like the rain, like the spring showers that waters the land. That's a text.
Listen,
That
when I
is
say
a
shout
text.
on reading the Bible, that's what I mean right there.
But here's the thing that captured my eye just briefly as I was reading that is Hosea is speaking to the people.
Yep.
But his first words are in this text, come let us return to the Lord.
Mm-hmm.
He sees himself as part of that corporate family, that
Yeah.
community of faith that is called to return to the Lord.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not standing outside telling you what to do.
No.
I'm actually part of the community, and I'm saying, come let us return to the Lord. And that dichotomy in this language, for he has torn us, and he will heal us. He has wounded us, and he will bind us up. But that call ultimately is to repent and to turn back to the Lord.
And it's the same idea, and I've used this kind of this analogy or illustration before. When you talk about God's tearing and healing and wounding and binding up of the wounds, in the same way that a doctor, in order to get to the heart, has to cut the person open and crack their chest, their ribs, in order to fix their heart. They injure them in order to heal them.
Yeah.
And in the same way, that's what God does with us sometimes in our circumstances and in our lives, to bring us to repentance, because he's trying to fix our heart. So some things have to be cut, some things have to be cracked. But the same doctor that cuts and cracks also puts that person back together again and gives them the prescription and the process from which they'll find full healing. And so that's. But the heart is the most important matter, and that call to repentance is a call that we all still should be hearing, to turn to the Lord, to turn from our rebellion to the cross of Jesus Christ. For those of us in New Testament believers, turn to that cross and to receive that gift of grace that God has given. And it's also prophetic. It's a picture of what Christ will have to bear on our behalf.
Yeah.
Because in the spirit, he is the one who will be torn and wounded and who will be raised on the third day.
And so that's good, because you were able to do the historical context there and then also apply it to the cross. And I think a lot of people, when they read verse 2, and you mentioned this in a recent sermon, that there's immediate fulfillment on many of these prophetic words, right? Yeah. And then there's also kind of this Christ-centered fulfillment. But when we read this, he will revive us after 2 days, and he'll raise us up on the third day. Yeah, that's resurrection. Everybody want to run to the cross in that moment, right? Yeah. But the people are speaking here symbolically, because they are going to be rescued from their exile, right? Yes. So we have to ground ourselves in the Old Testament before we run to the cross.
Absolutely. There's that immediate fulfillment, and then sometimes a further distant fulfillment, and then ultimate fulfillment. And that's what makes prophecy so spectacular. That's the reason the writer of Hebrews is saying God spoke through the prophets, because the reason the prophets did not fully grasp it was because they could not see all of God's moving and working. And thanks be to God, we can look retrospectively at those levels and layers of fulfillment that happened historically, that happened Christologically, and that ultimately will happen eschatologically as well.
Yeah. So we talked about judgment, talked about repentance. Let's talk about restoration. And I think we about to get in trouble. Y'all's favorite verse. Smash their coffee mugs.
John finna mess up y'all's favorite verse. I agree with y'all.
I ain't do it.
I agree with y'all, but John gonna make you read the context and understand it properly, and you're gonna have to cross this out on your vision board, which you're not supposed to have anyway. But
you don't agree now. Come on, let's talk about this. Let's talk about the prophet Jeremiah.
Let me lie one time, John. Let me lie one time.
Jeremiah 29.
Jeremiah
and
29 11.
29 and 11.
Yep.
I'm going to read that verse, but we got to talk about the context of this verse, okay? And I think it's important for us to talk about that. So, listen, I know y'all know it by heart, many of y'all. For I know the plans I have for you. This is the Lord's declaration, plans for your well-being, not for disaster, to give you a future and a hope.
Ooh.
But who is this addressed to?
What is happening?
What is happening in the land, and what is God telling them to do in order for him to get to saying, I know the plans that I have for you and to give you a future and a hope? What is happening here?
They have lost everything.
Yeah.
First of all, Jeremiah and others tried to tell them, hey, y'all repent now. Y'all turn back to the Lord, or else you're going into Babylon. And then Jeremiah's contemporaries, many of them said, no, you ain't.
Yep.
God ain't going to do that. God is too good for you to have to struggle like that.
That's right.
God, it's your soft life season. All while they out there being idolatrous and all that, it's your soft life. You don't have to worship. You don't have to be concerned about justice. You don't have to be generous. Just, focus on yourself. Make yourself number one. This is what's happening in the nation at that time. This is the southern kingdom.
Yep.
And Jeremiah says, no, God ain't pleased, and God's going to send you into Babylon. He's going to let Babylon. They call the name Babylon. They call the name the Chaldeans. And says it's going to happen. Well, guess what? It happens.
It happened.
586 BC. Y'all hear us talk about it all the time. It's actually 3 campaigns over the course of about 10 years or so. The last one is 586 BC. They tear down a temple, burn it down, burn the city gates with fire. They take the best and the brightest young people, and they take them to Babylon. Daniel, his 3 friends, Hananiah, Azariah, Mishael, who we know as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Their Hebrew names are Azariah, Mishael, Hananiah, Azariah, Mishael. Their Babylonian names are Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Take the best and the brightest, take all the good stuff out of the temple, and they take it back, and now they ain't got nothing. So then the prophets who said it wasn't going to happen start saying, well, it's only going to be a year or 2. Don't even unpack.
Don't unpack.
Don't even unpack. Don't even unpack. Leave out your suitcase.
It's an Airbnb stay.
Yeah. That's good. Don't even unpack. It ain't gonna be long. Any day now. Turn around 3 times, and in 30 days, God's gonna give you. And Jeremiah is alone saying, nope, it ain't gonna be a year or 2 or a short time. It's gonna be 70 years.
Yep.
70 years.
Yeah.
And that ain't what they wanted to hear.
And he writes a letter. It's not no Aaliyah 4-page letter. He's writing them a letter to say, listen, it's gonna be a while.
It's gonna be a while.
And he tells them, he build houses, live in them, plant gardens, eat their produce, find wives for yourselves. Settle in. Because it's going to be another 70 years. Then.
And he says, here's what I need you to know for the long period of time you're going to have to deal with this. I know what I'm doing.
I know the plans that I have for you. Plans for your well-being, even though you may be in a situation that you don't like, not for disaster, to give you a future and a hope.
Yeah.
So unpack your bags and rest on that promise.
That's the whole
You can
point.
keep it on the mug, but you got to understand that you might be in this season for 70 years.
Yeah, this is not the promise, that westernized view of quick and at once and right now and microwaved results, those kinds of things. Some processes take time. You all will remember, we talk about it often because that's a major part of a lot of the Old Testament prophecy is, 586 BC, that temple is torn down, burned down, ransacked.
Yep.
They get released by Cyrus, king of Persia, in about 538. And then they rebuild the temple, and it's 516 or so, 515, 516 BC when they dedicate it again. And so you have the 70 years from the tearing down of the temple to the rededication of the new one. And y'all, it took a while. And it was hard, and it was discouraging. They get to Babylon, and the psalmist famously says, we hung our harps on the willows. How can we sing the Lord's song in a strange land? And Jeremiah's like, listen, settle in. You got yourself here because of your decisions, but God is not done with you yet.
Yeah.
There is restoration on the horizon. And so they had something to hold on to give you a future and a hope. I love the King James here. It calls it an expected end. The process might be painful, but what the process is producing is going to be worth the process.
And there's a microcosm of what we've been talking about. It's like Jeremiah cuts them, but then he gives them the healing words right there at the end. And we see that in a lot of prophetic messages and words. Let's look at this final one, and that is what God speaks through prophecies that are pertaining to Christ himself.
Yes.
And we'll look at one in Matthew 2 that is a reference to not just an Old Testament text, but Old Testament concept more so in 2:23. And we see that here. This is, I'm going to start at 19. After Herod died, the angel of the Lord appeared in a dream to Joseph. Get up, take the child and his mother, and go to the land of Israel, because those who intended to kill the child are dead. So he got up, took the child and his mother, and entered the land of Israel. But when he heard that Archelaus was ruling over Judea in place of his father Herod, he was afraid to go there. And being warned in a dream, he withdrew to the region of Galilee. Then he went and settled in the town called Nazareth to fulfill what was spoken through the prophets, that he would be called a Nazarene. Now, I'm going to say this. There is no direct prophecy that said that Jesus would be called a Nazarene, but most scholars believe that this is a reference to Isaiah 53, talking about the humble beginnings of the suffering servant who is Christ himself.
Yes.
It talked about him being despised, being rejected, being in that low place, which Nazareth, in that culture, we talked about him being from that region in Galilee, but that area was known as the lowland, so the country.
Yeah, it's the ghetto hood.
That's it.
Country hood. Country hood. So it's the boondocks and it's the hood at the same time. You know, I say all the time, man, and you'll be all right when it's going to go down. You know, a lot of people say something is country when they mean Southern. You know, so there's a difference between Southern culture and some being country. You know, Southern culture can be genteel and, you know, gone with the wind. That's Southern culture. Country is eating hog balls and fatback and souse meat. You know what I'm saying? That's two different things.
That's totally different.
Southern people eat ham. Country folk eat pigs. You know what I'm saying? Jesus is, he's hood country. That's where he's raised.
That's it.
And Isaiah bears that out prophetically. And then that fulfillment, we see it here in Matthew chapter 2, verse 23, that he would be called Nazarene. The other issues are with the language here. That Nazarene refers to, again, that low estate. While it is a physical place, that, again, those layers of fulfillment, it layers up to demonstrate that it's a place and a condition, which is why later on when Nathaniel meets him, or is told about him, and he says, "Hey, man, can anything good come out of Nazareth?"
Yep.
That's the country hood.
Like, I know Nazareth. There ain't nothing good over there in Nazareth.
You don't get an Airbnb in Nazareth. You know what I'm saying? You don't get an Airbnb
unless you're gentrifying.
Yeah, right. Well.
So we've talked about how God spoke before Christ through the prophets. The writer now turns in Hebrews chapter 1 to how God speaks through Christ himself, directly by his son. And there's at least 7 pieces of praise that he does in these 4 verses that talks about how God has spoken through his son. And we're going to look at the Old Testament references that align with each one of these identifying characteristics. I think it's going to be helpful for us to understand that he's actually drawing on this idea and concept from the Old Testament as we work through it. So the first thing we learn about what he spoke through Christ, and we know that he speaks directly through him, through his nature and his ministry, is that he is the heir of all things.
Yeah, he talks about the preeminence of Christ, and preeminence. It's not just like Jesus exceeds. Like he doesn't. We're not racing, and the Old Testament gets a head start, and then Jesus comes back and catches up and passes it.
Right.
Ain't no race.
That's good. Yeah.
You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
It's no race. Jesus, before the Old Testament, Jesus was all these things. And the Old Covenant simply, the prophets of old were simply pointing to an existing reality that had not yet been revealed. So all of these things have always been eternally true about Jesus Christ. They existed already, but they had not been revealed historically in time.
Yeah.
And this is what we mean by his preeminence, that he goes before. Yeah.
Yeah, and it says in verse 2, in these last days he has spoken to us by his Son. God has appointed him heir of all things and made the universe through him. And this is a direct reference to Psalm chapter 2, or at least an indirect reference to Psalm chapter 2, where, and we talked about the Psalms before and talked about them not being laid out chronologically, but theologically in a sense. And this second Psalm is about the coronation of Jesus as the Son, as God's Son, or coronation of this figure as God's Son. And we see this in verses number 7 and 8. It says, I will declare the Lord's decree. He said to me, you are my son. Today I have become your father. May sound familiar if you're thinking about the baptism account.
Absolutely, yep.
Ask of me, and I will make the nations your inheritance and the ends of the earth your possession. So this verse number 8 has this heir language. Like if you ask me, I will make the nations inheritance. Inheritance language, you all know about inheritance. If you have ever inherited anything from family members, that makes you the heir of whatever it is that family member is given. This is a concept that's clear in both the first century and also in the Old Testament, that heirs inherited certain things.
Yes.
And so the writer of Hebrews tells us that Jesus is the heir of all things.
All things.
Nothing lays outside of his, I'm going to say this, airness. It's not even a word, but it sounds good.
Yeah.
Lays outside of him being the heir of, and the writer will go on and talk about that as well.
Yeah.
But we see that heir language with Jesus, which helps us understand this idea of you and I and believers being adopted.
Right.
As heirs of Christ.
Yeah. So we become this. So what the amazing thing about our faith in Christ and the privilege of it and the grace we experience is we are called adopted. We're then told we are joint heirs.
Yeah. Yep.
We are adopted as if we are firstborns, because the culture said firstborn gets 2/3 and everybody else splits
divides
1/3.
up the rest.
Yeah.
Yep.
Whatever's left, you divide it up. Well, listen, not for us. Christ, who is the only begotten of the Father, who is the heir of all things, says you get to share equally in my inheritance. And that's what makes him better. What makes him better than the best of the prophets' declarations is that he inherits everything, and then he gives us equal share in the blessing, as if we are born into the family and our firstborn.
Yeah, and Paul kind of writes a companion to this in Galatians, where he talks about that heir nature and says, hey, all the people who are heirs, they're under what's called a tutor or a teacher, and he compares that to being under the law prior to them being able to be mature enough in order for them to step into being heirs. Yeah. And he makes that comparison, that illustration, and saying that, hey, I don't need y'all to be under the law, under this yoke of the law now, because that which is better is here now.
Yeah, absolutely.
Which makes us joint heirs with him, because he's the one who is the ultimate heir, the firstborn.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
So we also see him as the creator of all things here in this text.
Yep.
God has appointed him the heir of all things. and made the universe through him.
Yes.
Now that's huge. Huge. For all the folks who are saying that Jesus was not God in the flesh.
Right. That he's not divine.
Mm-hmm.
Or that or
not
that he's
present in the creation account.
Yeah, somehow even if he's deity, he's a lesser deity or a lower one, or he graduated to godness at some point through his life. No, Scripture is clear, and the Scripture says this over and over again. We've read it many times in Colossians chapter 1. All things, Jesus is creator.
Yeah.
John 1, Word was made flesh. But prior, Word was with God, Word was God. All things were made by him.
Yeah.
And without him, nothing that was made was made. Jesus, in the same way, is the heir of all things. Jesus is the creator of all things. Present at creation as the living Word of God. God speaks, and that Word, who is Christ, is what creates everything we see in the material world.
Mm-hmm. And so you don't really have to look far to see Jesus as God in the flesh, and also even him making claims that he's God. Every time they pick up stones to throw at him and to kill him, that's because he's blaspheming and saying that I'm God in
man.
the flesh.
That's, people, Jesus never claimed to be God. Yes, he did. That's why they tried to kill him multiple times before he finally surrendered and said, all right, y'all kill me. He over and over again. Before Abraham was, I am. That's the I am of Exodus 3. I am that I am.
Yeah.
He was explicit that he was God. That was his explicit claim, and that's why they wanted to kill him so bad. Yeah. And then he was backing it up with his power. Proving it.
That's it. So verse 3, the Son is the radiance of God's glory and the exact expression of his nature, sustaining all things by his powerful word.
Yeah.
3 things involved there. First of all, the radiance of God's glory.
Yes.
And then secondly, we have that he was the representative of God, the exact imprint, another text says, of his nature. And then finally, he sustains everything by the power of his word. So there are 3 things there. First, he says that Christ is technically and literally God's daybreak.
That's wonderful. Yeah.
The breaking of the day.
Yeah.
And he says that he's the radiance of God's glory.
And look at that picture of the radiance of the daybreak. It's the same idea as if it's creation again. The evening and the morning were the first day. Yes, right. God gives evening lights, lesser lights, so that if the moon is out and the stars are shining, you can kind of see at night, but it ain't nothing like when the sun comes up. In the same way, the prophets of old were reflections or distant lights, reflection like the moon or distant like other stars, so that there is some ability to know God and grasp but when Christ comes, the sun rises, literally. The sun rises so that you can fully see. That's what it means that he is the radiance. And watch that word. That's what we're emphasizing this year, all year long. This is why we're lifting higher. He's the radiance of God's glory.
God's glory.
I do not glorify God. I do not know the glory of God. I do not understand the glory of God, other than the fact that Christ shines it for us. And therefore I can know God and walk with God. And that's why my life should be filled with worship and with praise and with obedience and with service and all of the elements. And I should reach out to others evangelistically and be generous and all of those things, because I see now, because the sun is up.
So, yes, sir.
I see.
And that's what we learned in the Transfiguration account a couple of seasons ago.
Yeah.
And so we also see the exact imprint of his nature, which in these terms literally means a stamp. God's stamp has been placed on him. It's used of this coinage in this culture where they would stamp authenticity on whatever coin they had. So he's saying that God's placed his stamp on him as the exact imprint.
It's a notarized. it's this is not a copy.
Yes, sir.
We are to be copies of the Christ and God. He is the exact what He is the exact pressing of the nature of God. The imprint is the first one, not a copy. And that language. So again, we're talking about God. Christ is the exact imprint, notarized. Take the gold and bite it with your mouth. Make sure it don't bend and chip. That's him. Which is much better than the prophets.
And it takes us back again to Genesis, because God created humankind in the Imago Dei, which was marred through the fall. And then he shows up in perfect form in Jesus Christ as the exact imprint of God's nature. Of God's nature.
Absolutely.
So, and then we also see here, because of all this, we see that he sustains all things by his powerful word.
By the word,
which means he is the representative of God and the word of God himself. I love what the Shepherd of Hermas says. He says that the name of the Son carries the entire world. That in his name, the entire world is sustained or carried. And that's what we get in this idea of all things being sustained by his powerful word.
It is what they're trying to find in physics and astrophysics, is that dark matter. What is it that's actually holding all of this together? The Bible tells us it's the very word of God, who is Jesus Christ. That's holding all things together. Colossians 1 bears that out as well.
That's right. And then we also see him as the high priest of God. It says, after making purification for sins, he sat down at the right hand of the majesty on high.
Yeah, I want y'all to stay tuned in to these lessons.
We're going to talk about priesthood.
We're going to get on his priesthood. But again, as we're comparing him to the prophets could predict, the prophets could proclaim, but they could not purify.
Sir.
And that's what the high priest does. That's what this high priest does. Yeah.
And then we also find him as the King of Kings here. We see that he sat down at the right hand of the majesty on high. And we've talked about this before, but cultural concept of the right hand and being sat on the right hand of whoever the king is at the time in those cultures was that person shared power with the person who was sitting on the throne. So as you can see, the disciples are clamoring for Jesus to be able to say, hey, you sit on my right and left hand, because first in command was right, second in command was left, and they wanted those positions. Well, the Bible tells us through and through, and Jesus says it himself, that he sat down once he became the ultimate sacrifice, which we're going to get to. He sat down at the right hand of the Father, that position of power.
It's a position of authority and advocacy. The person at the right hand has authority to make decisions and also has the ear of the sovereign as the sovereign is making decisions. The same way Christ sits at the right hand of God, and the Bible says what his activity is right now is constantly talking to God on our behalf, our advocate, our intercessor, sitting at the right hand, making intercession for us. And we're grateful to God for that.
Yeah. So we see that at work in Paul's writings in Philippians 2. We've talked about the Christ hymn before, where he takes on the form of a servant, and then God exalts him and gives them the name that's above every name.
Yeah, let me plug my creatives again. This is a song of praise to the glory of God for as it explains the nature of Jesus Christ, that he took on the form of a servant, became obedient to death, even the death on the cross, and God highly exalted him, gave him a name that's above every name, at which every knee must bow and every tongue must confess. And by the way, that name is not Jesus. The name he's referring to is the title Lord. That's the one. He is the Kyrios is the Greek word. He is the Lord of all. That's the title that will cause all creation, those above, in and beneath creation, to bow to him. Yeah.
And so the writer of Hebrews then turns and says, because of all this, he became superior to the angels, just as the name he inherited is more excellent than theirs. Now, this seems like an interesting turn, because he's talking about the prophets. he then turns to Jesus being superior to the prophets. Then he said, I got something else to tell you too.
Yeah. And this, again, this sounds like a sermon. Not only prophets, but my second movement is he's better than angels. I know you know he's better than the prophets. Let me move on now to tell you he's also better than angels. Again, this is if I'm preaching, Pastor John, this is what I would call, I need you to have a strong transition statement.
Yeah, it is.
Even if I'm calling this first part an introduction, I need a clear transition statement into the movements of your sermon. And that's what this is, as he goes from prophets to angels, from the ways God has spoken now to the ministering spirits that, again, in the Jewish mind, in the Hebrew culture, would be so honored and revered, and rightfully so.
Yep.
Yeah.
Oh, and we're going to talk about angels.
Angels, yeah.
But y'all going to have to wait.
Yeah.
Till the next episode.
Yeah. Okay, let me say this before we go. Let me say this about angels. Psych. No, come back. Go back next study. We'll get with these angels. Yeah. It's gonna be rich.
Yeah. So we've covered him talking about the prophets and how God spoke to the prophets, and then also how God spoke through Christ. And now, next episode, we're going to talk about how he is not just better than the prophets, but better than the angels.
Better than angels, because he's better.
Yeah.
He's better. Yeah.
Well, thank you for joining us for this episode of the Growth Factor podcast. I am grateful to you all for joining us for this episode. And I'm excited about this particular season. It's going to be dope. And I want you all to share this on the various platforms that you have. If you're listening to us on any podcast platform, also go over to our Growth Factor page on Facebook. We have a great community over there that you can help being shepherded through this text and through what it looks like to be better, and to also experience a Christ who is better. We have a great online campus pastor and Pastor Crystal. She'll help you guys. We got folks all over the nation every day trying to figure out how to do life with one another, and want you all to be part of that community. If you want to go ahead and share this with other folks, go ahead and share the Facebook page. Do that for us. Next go round, we're going to be talking about them angels. So come through.
Amen.
This has been The Growth Factor, a broadcast ministry of St. Mark Baptist Church. Be sure to follow this podcast on your favorite podcast platform and join our Facebook group, The Growth Factor, for daily motivational content. Let's keep the conversation going. Thank you for listening.